The first step to setting up our flip simulation will be to build the sources, and I've created a geometry object at the object level here to do our river setup. So let's dive inside there, and then object merge in the terrain and the rocks. So I'll drop in that object merge and point this to object / environment / out terrain, and make sure that we're grabbing the high-res version of the terrain here. Let's turn off other objects so we're not seeing everything else in the scene as well. So this is just giving us that top portion of the terrain here. Make sure that this is the high-res version because we want our river to nicely line up with our render mesh. And let's also object merge in the rocks. Point that object merge to object / rocks / out river rocks. And I'll template display those. And now we can just isolate the portion of the terrain that we're going to have the river flowing through here. And when we created this riverbed area in our height field, we used a mask to set that up. And that mask attribute still exists on our terrain here. So I'll just drop in a blast. And for the group, set that to @mask = 0. And the group type will be points because that's a point attribute. And then display that. So with that blast stop, this is isolating the area of the terrain that the river is flowing through, and this looks like it's working pretty well, although in this case, the area of the riverbed is extending a bit beyond these rocks that I've placed here as part of that border. So you can tweak these riverbed area attributes if you need to. So to tweak this, I'm going to set the rocks to the normal template display instead of solid. And then I'll drop in an attribute paint to paint out that region that we don't want to be included in the river. So drop that paint between the object merge and our blast, and then display that. And by default, the attribute paint is painting a mask attribute. So if you hit enter with your mouse cursor in the viewport, that'll bring up your attribute paint tool. And you can see all the areas that already have existing mask values indicated here. And it doesn't really look like we have those mask values extending beyond the rock here, but maybe it's just very small values for that mask. So let's paint that out just to make sure these areas aren't included. So I'll mouse wheel up to increase the size of our brush here. And you can either control click to paint the background value of 0, or a left click to paint the background value of 1. So in this case, we want these areas to be painted to 0, so I'll control click and paint out this region that goes beyond the rock. And I'll do another pass with an increased volume size just to make sure that we don't have any of those mask values slipping through in this region here. So hopefully that does the trick. It is a little bit hard to see if those are just very small values there. But in any case, if you display the blast node now you can see that those areas are removed from the riverbed region. So if I bypass this attribute paint, you can see it's including this section, and after that paint, that area is removed. So that looks all good. And ultimately, we are going to want this river simulation to extend a little bit beyond both edges of the terrain here. In order to get this to look nice at these borders where it's going to be cut off, we do want this to be just smoothly flowing past that a bit. So to create a little extension on both sides of the riverbed, I'm going to do a poly extrude, but we want to create a group along this edge that we can use in the poly extrude just to extend those regions there instead of extending everywhere. So I'll create a new group sub. And I'm going to drop this before the blast for that mask attribute, or it could also go before the attribute paint. It doesn't really make much difference. I'll call this group border, and then set the group name to border, and display that. And turn off primitive groups, and then turn on include by edges, and turn on unshared edges. So this is going to create a group just along the edge of our terrain here. But right now it's just grabbing all of the primitives along that edge, and we want this to actually grab the edges, not those primitive faces. So on this group, go back up to the top and change the group type to edges. So you can see now just the very edge is selected. And now if we display the blast, then we can add a poly extrude to extend that region. So drop in that poly extrude, and in the group, we'll select border, display the poly extrude, and then increase that distance. At this large scale for that terrain, you do have to turn this up quite a bit in order to get much of an extension there. And it looks like a distance of 15 works reasonably well. And we are getting some slightly weird results from this poly extrude. It doesn't have to look perfect because we're never really going to see these entrance and exit regions of that river. So it doesn't have to look great. This side is probably fine as it is. But the other side is looking a little bit too broken, and we don't really want this river region to shoot off to the side like this. So there are a couple things we could try to address this. We could just use our selection tool and go to point selection, select this one point and delete that. And then this should work just fine. Another option is to, instead of using this distance-based extrusion here, we can try turning that off. Just set the distance to 0, and then turn on Transform Extruded Front. We'll set the transform space to global, and then the pivot is going to be the center of our river here. So for our pivot translate, I'll type in centroid of input 1, which is just our current geometry, and then d_x for the x-axis, and then select that and copy it, and tab to go to the y component, change dx to dy, tab to the z component, paste that, change dx to dz, and then we can increase just the x and the z scale of this. So I'll copy the x scale, copy that parameter, paste relative reference into z, and then increase the scale here. So you can see this is just scaling out those edges away from the center point of this riverbed. And this is probably a little bit more buffer region than we need. So I'll turn down this extrusion scale just a little bit. That looks pretty good. And this is looking a lot cleaner than it did a moment ago. So let's check the other side as well, just to make sure that this end looks like it'll work well enough for us. So this region looks nice and clean also. So we'll go ahead with this, and then we can merge together the rocks and the riverbed for our general area of interest. So I'll bring the rocks down here, merge those together, connect the terrain and the rocks, and display that. And right now, this is still a very large scale terrain. It's about 476 units long, so let's scale this down to a more reasonable simulation scale to work on this. It might be fine to simulate things at this larger scale, but I generally like to keep things within smaller numerical ranges. So I'll drop in a transform, call this sim scale, display that, and I'm going to set this sim scale to 0.2. This gives us a river that's about 95 units long instead, which seems a bit more reasonable, so I'll zoom in on that, and then we can add a null here. I'll call this area of interest, and we're going to be adding a lot of things to our river setup here, so I'll start creating some boxes around some of these key sections just to keep things nice and clean. So I'll create a box around that and call this area of interest.